There are a number of online commentators who are talking about what they are describing as a femininity crisis, okay? And what we as women often need to do is always be looking at what the invisible contracts are. When we hear, especially when we hear men and women from certain schools of thought pushing this idea that there is a femininity crisis. Because we first of all need to ask ourselves, what is femininity? Who gets to decide what femininity is for you? Okay. And according to whom is there a supposed femininity crisis? And more importantly, who benefits from the current definition of femininity? Now, there are a number of visible contracts here around femininity that we're going to go through in this session. And by the end of this session, you are free to decide what femininity is for you, what it means to you, but equally, whether indeed you actually feel as though you are in a crisis as a woman as related to your femininity. So the first invisible contract when it comes to femininity is that femininity must be legible, okay, to other people. And what that means is that women are often expected to perform femininity in ways that other people and systems of power recognize, reward, and incentivize. Now, here are some of those ways that we are told indicate and reflect authentic femininity. Marriage. So as a woman, you're often expected to desire marriage to a man specifically, okay? And you are expected to seek marriage. Motherhood. As a woman, femininity is often connected to a desire to bear children and to actually go on to mother children. The other way that femininity often plays out is this softness, nurturing. Of course, submission is viewed to be inherently feminine, which is very interesting. We can talk about that. Agreeableness, and of course, demonstrating or performing emotional labor. Okay, women are often told that they are emotional. Okay, and that is a quintessential element of femininity. Now, let's just be very clear here. All right, femininity does not have to look one particular way, but we live in a world where systems of power, including culture, religion, patriarchy, misogyny, all of those systems of power have defined very narrowly what femininity looks like and how other people should be experiencing you as a woman. And so femininity has become something that most women will aspire to because they've been conditioned and programmed to perform femininity in a very restricted way. Now, isn't it interesting that submission is regarded as feminine? It has become gendered, when in actual fact, submission, when you look at the definition of submission, is not indeed gendered. But the way submission shows up in society, in culture, in the family system of power, in religion as system of power, it has very much been gendered, okay, in its concept, but also in its application. In practice, this is something that women are expected to do, to submit, usually to the men in their lives. And there's a through line for women. So you are usually being obedient as a child, okay, to your father. And then as an adult woman, if you're unmarried, you are meant to be humble. So you're usually submitting in some kind of way in society. And then you go on to get married, and now you are required to submit to a husband who is the head of your household. It's very interesting that, because generally speaking, if you have conversations with men, they do not see submission as a masculine thing. And often they are not interested, willing, attracted to submitting to another human being in the ways that they have been conditioned and programmed to expect women to submit. Now, people don't like to hear this, but it is the truth. Okay, the typical common ways that women are incentivized, encouraged, required to submit in society. And you can look submit in the workplace, submit in the family setting, submit during sex even. Those are not ways that men generally, generally would perceive to be masculine. They are not ways in which men generally would voluntarily sign up to behave and to submit, not only to submit to a woman half the day, but also to submit to other men. There's a reason why there are so many men who struggle in corporate structures. It isn't just because of how rigid, okay, corporate structures are. It's not just because of the invisible language that is spoken in a corporate environment and the way in reality people navigate corporate environments, especially if they want to ascend that hierarchical ladder. It is also because there is the structure itself requires submission from all in some kind of way. Okay. And a lot of the time, in my experience, especially when I speak to and I've observed and researched men who have never worked in a corporate environment, a lot of it is because they do not want to submit to authority. And the thing about a corporate environment is when you go into the corporate environment and you start at the bottom, that's what you're doing. All right. There are steps that one has to take in order to ascend. It's required usually of everybody. Now, that includes the people that you believe are skipping the line and because of personality and charisma, everybody's got to start somewhere. The corporate environment of all environments requires submission in some kind of way to a manager, to a CEO, to the processes and systems in the organization. And that is why when you hear a lot of men in particular say that they don't want a boss, right? That they've gone their own way independently. They've started their own businesses, done various endeavors because the corporate environment requires submission. That's what it does. It requires submission. And generally speaking, when you think about how the education system functions, women and girls and women are actually taught to obey and submit. So I know there's a whole conversation that is often had about how the education system is essentially feminine. But actually, if we follow that thought through in more ways than one of the things it does do is prepare women for the corporate environment in the sense that the same way you are being asked to sit down quietly on the carpet, cross your legs, put your hand up to speak, and the way girls tend to adapt to that culture, it translates rather well into corporate structures where there is submission required. And there are all sorts of invisible contracts at play in the workplace for women. And a lot of the time, most women have put their head down, they learn the rules, they learn the process, and they try to navigate the process as smoothly as they can. Now, that doesn't mean it always works out, but that is the method. All right. And so it's very interesting that submission, generally speaking, is deemed to be a feminine thing. And you are rewarded and incentivized as a woman to be submissive by systems of power. In fact, a lot of women will perform submission in the dating process in order to be chosen and selected, even if inside they don't feel that way. If you look at a lot of this femininity coaching, a lot of this femininity and dating content out there, a lot of it is coded with women submitting, whether it's submitting cognitively, submitting mentally and emotionally, or submitting physically. And they're submitting to the process. You see, a lot of the times when you really listen, there's a brilliant, there's some brilliant examples of this. When you look at those dating gurus, self-improvement gurus who help women find the love of their life, or even matchmaking services, when you look at the things that they advise women to do, essentially women are at least submitting to the way the world works. They submit to the process, so they may change the way they dress. Wasn't it the classic in the Sex and the City series, one of the recent ones? One of the women, she had a matchmaker and she had to change the way she dressed. She had to change the things that she was saying on the date. She was submitting to the way the system of dating works, to the way the dating market functions. So submission is required in many ways for women. And what you'll find is, generally speaking, women will look at the things that they want, especially when it involves being chosen by a man. And you'll find 9 times out of 10, women are willing to follow through and submit to the process of dating in order to get chosen. There's a lady who is on all the social platforms, but she does a call-in thing where women will call in live and ask for advice about what they're wearing, where they're going to meet men. Nearly every one of those women, I mean, there are a few women for some reason who call in and then don't want to take her advice, which is very bizarre, but I would say 98% of the women who call in, right there on live, they'll go and find a new dress. They'll put new earrings on. They'll change their shoes right there and then, because they are willing and they understand that they need to submit to the dating process in order to be chosen by a man. Now, they could be sitting there in their comfiest clothes, things that doesn't matter. If it means they're going to get the man, they are willing to express, they are willing to perform femininity in the ways that they've been advised to do so in order to be chosen. Okay, so submission is very heavily connected to the way women are encouraged to show up and perform to show that they are feminine. To show that they are feminine. You're meant to be softly spoken. It's one of the things that I don't do, okay? And quite often it ruffles feathers. People will say to me, oh, you're very harsh, you're very hard. The reality is, in terms of my character, I'm none of those things. But because of my tone of voice, because of my cadence, because of my the way I articulate myself, it's not deemed to be feminine enough. And it's not deemed to be feminine enough often by men or other women. Okay? And so softness, people talk about being in their soft life. There was a comment on one of my recent Substacks, and the commentator said, yes, so sometimes really if we're softly spoken, people are more likely to accept us. Any major revolution that has happened in this world, it was not gotten through softness. Let us be very clear. Any major revolution, change in system, or fundamental progress that has been made, softness is not what defines that movement at all. Okay? And if softness was deployed, that was deployed strategically, often. Okay? So it's not a requirement of femininity. And this is why we have to always be interrogating what the premise that we're being sold and what the invisible contracts are around that premise. Because here's the thing, if there wasn't so much incentive and supposed reward socially, financially, sexually, even for women, and when I talk about sexual, I'm talking about romantic relationships, because, femininity doesn't win you orgasms. It doesn't do that. The most submissive women out there who are married are not having orgasms regularly, consistently, and more than women who aren't soft and supposedly feminine. But that's a different thing. You see, when we start looking at the invisible contracts at play, the difference between what you're promised and told and sold and what the lived reality is when it comes to femininity. The other major kind of invisible contract around femininity is that you must be useful. Okay? Many of the definitions of femininity in some way or another are describing utility, usefulness, not womanhood, usefulness. Okay, so you must be accommodating, you must be patient, you must be nurturing, you must be self-sacrificing, you must be supportive. You see, you must be emotionally available. And not only when it comes to men in terms of romantic relationships, but in your mothering. Motherhood is one of the greatest sacrifices a woman could make. And no matter what your children do, you are expected to show up in a certain way. You're expected to show up in certain ways for your friends, for your parents. It is expected often that women will burn themselves out, often at their own expense. But that is deemed to be feminine. It is rewarded. When you hear a lot of men, notice I say a lot of, I didn't say all. But there is definitely a pattern when you hear men describe their mothers and why they love them. Almost always, the majority of the memories and the traits that they may call to mind are linked to usefulness. It is linked to hard work. It is linked to their mother making sacrifices. That is coded into what femininity and womanhood is deemed to be. That is why women are often told they're lazy. For example, if they don't cook and clean for their husband. There's a really funny actually content creator on TikTok, and she talks about all of the ways that she's lazy, and you can see it in the comments. People say, well, what do you do? Why has he got you there? Because of course a grown man couldn't possibly feed himself. An adult man, an adult human being who is a leader, no less, he can't possibly feed himself, right? So they ask her all the time, what is your utility? Why does he have you there? Why did he choose you? You don't sound very useful, and therefore you're not very feminine, and therefore you're breaking the contract of womanhood, right? And so femininity is closely linked to usefulness. If you as a woman are resting too much, playing too much, if you are not using your talents and your strengths, I can't tell you the number of people who say to me, Ashanti, you would make a wonderful wife. The strength you could bring to a marriage, the way you could support and build a man, the life you could speak into a man. So when people meet me sometimes, they recognize my brilliance. But what they automatically connect it to is how it could be used in conjunction with a man. Specifically in the role of being a man's partner and or wife, because I would never be anybody's girlfriend. Right? So you see there, they can't just see me and think, wow, that's great for her. That's great for her. And maybe the community that she serves and her family and her friends. No. You would reach your highest. All of that would be best used in the capacity of a wife to a man. So there's an expectation that you will be useful if you are indeed feminine. Okay. The other thing is that you must accept external definitions. This is one I have a real problem with, as you know, right? Because one of the biggest invisible contracts governing women's lives is that you allow external systems of power and men to define who you are as a woman. Okay. And this is the one, actually, because everybody else becomes an authority. They know you better than you know yourself. And even if you say, I don't want this, or this is what I want, people will tell you, no, that's not true. This is why you see all this nonsense conversation whereby other people are speaking for single women and saying that you are lonely, you are sad. Meanwhile, a lot of us, not all, but a lot of us are at home quite peaceful, quite joyful, having a wonderful time day to day. pH balance intact, peace of mind, joy. But other people want to tell you who you are and how you feel. Apparently, they know you better than you. The other day, I had to say to someone, you're a complete stranger. How can you know me better than I know me? There is no human being on this earth that can tell me and legitimately say that they know me better than I know myself. That is ridiculous, absurd. And yet, girls and women are conditioned and programmed to outsource the sense of self, the knowing of self, and the certainty in knowing yourself to other external powers, whether they be men or systems of power, right? Whether it's religion, conservative commentators who want to tell you that because you're a single woman in your 30s, you will regret this in 20 years' time. Trad wives, executive women, dating coaches, governments, influencers. Everybody wants to tell women this is femininity. But very few are actually asking women, what does femininity mean to you? And the reason for that is they don't want you to think for yourself. They don't want you to reclaim and assume that rightful authority over how you see yourself, how you choose to express yourself, how you choose to function, how you choose to live. That is why it's so powerful when a woman does that. Okay, why do you think there's so much discourse, so much concern about the women who are supposedly just leaving perfectly happy marriages and getting up one day and thinking, I don't want to be here anymore. And so they're blowing up their families. They're disrupting an entire life trajectory for their children because they just got up one day and changed their mind. We infantilize women all of the time. Okay, but a lot of this discourse about, is it okay for a woman to leave a marriage that's happy? Happy according to who? Who says she doesn't know herself and what she wants? Who says she doesn't have the fundamental right to decide how she wants to spend her days and who she wants to spend her days with? You see how that works? You see how that works? The next invisible contract is that power is often hidden inside these femininity conversations. And let me talk about this. Let me explain to you what I mean by this, right? Take, for example, passport bros. Do love the passport bros, okay? They often talk about the fact that the reason why they're leaving places like the US and the UK to seek wives abroad is because women abroad are more feminine, they're more submissive, right? They know their place as women in the world and in relation to men. Now, here's the funny thing about that. They go abroad, and by the way, what I will say, this stuff is hugely this. Isn't it interesting how certain women from certain parts of the world are often portrayed to be weak, essentially? That's what they're being portrayed to be. This idea that Asian women are more immediate, but that's not actually a good thing. But they're always portrayed in that way entirely. But okay, okay, because here's the thing, right? Passport bros would have you believe that the women abroad in places like Asia, South America, wherever it is that they're going to find these women who are operating in their natural divine design, women who have not been corrupted by the West, women who've not been corrupted by feminism. Listen very carefully. Okay? Okay? So they've gone to these places to find women who are kind, who are warm, who are soft, feminine. They know how to treat a man. Women who've been raised to be wives. Okay? Then why don't they go and choose women in those places in the world who are educated, socially mobile? Why don't they go and choose those women? No, let's look at the women that generally they're choosing in those countries. Now, they're telling you that they're choosing those women because those women are feminine and soft and know how to treat men. But let's look at the women that, generally speaking, are being chosen. These are women who often have very few socio-economic opportunities. They don't usually have social mobility. They're not of the highest social classes in those countries. Their families are often reliant on them, okay, because what happens is the families know the game. Okay, these women either are receiving money from the passport bro if they're still resident in that country of origin, or if they are moved over to the UK or the US, their expectation is that they're sending money back to their families. So they're not coming from families of a certain social class or economic level. They're not, most of the time, the most educated women in those countries. Because here's the thing, wealthy women can embody femininity too. A woman who's gone to school and been educated can embody femininity too. She could be kind, warm, gracious, and have emotional intelligence. But somehow, the passport bros and the men who promote that kind of culture, they don't choose highly educated women. They don't choose economically independent women. They choose women with less leverage, but they're telling you that they've chosen them because they're feminine. So that's interesting. So are we then to believe that the femininity of those women correlates with the fact that they have very few options, economically, education-wise, and socially? That suggests to me that something else is happening. The attraction is not mere femininity. The attraction is the power asymmetry. That's a huge difference. This is why you have to listen well. You have to think well. Yeah, because femininity, often what is being promoted is power asymmetry. And so when you as a woman perform femininity in the ways that are expected, what you are doing is giving up some of your power. That's what you're doing when you perform it in the way that's expected. Now, if you are embodying what you deem to be feminine, that's a different story. That's a different story because, again, each woman has the right to decide what femininity means to her and how she's going to express that. Couple of other points before we close. One in particular is that white femininity is often treated as universal femininity. So I talked a moment ago about passport bureaus and how they go to these other countries, these other places in the world where these women have been deemed to be more feminine. And actually, that isn't necessarily the case. There's a power asymmetry there. There's a codependence there, quite frankly, because they're not choosing women who have ultimate choice. But also in the mix of this conversation is that very few people talk about the fact that the type of femininity that is often promoted is white femininity. Okay, so what femininity will mean to a Nigerian grandmother, a Caribbean matriarch, a Korean woman, okay, a British aristocratic woman, for example, a Black American church member. Now, I'm obviously citing these examples deliberately. My point is that women perform or embody womanhood differently according to culture and traditions and customs. And so what womanhood and femininity will look like, I don't know, in Poland versus in Kenya, right? Versus in Hawaii. Have you seen those beautiful Samoan women? Yeah? And the cultures and the traditions. Yeah, this beautiful womanhood. But that's just one expression, but it doesn't often match white femininity, as in Europe and white America. So sometimes, again, we need to think about, when they say femininity is in crisis, well, according to who? What type of femininity? Who gets to decide what femininity is and what femininity is prioritized? These are the questions you have to ask yourself as a woman, right? Every generation is told that there is a femininity crisis, by the way. This is not a new conversation. When women started to flood into certain corporate workplaces, when women started to pick up certain jobs while men were at war, that was deemed to be a femininity crisis. It just depends on what stream of time we're in. So we have to be more critically thinking. And we can't allow external powers, external systems of power to define something so intrinsic for us as women. We get to define that. And that's what I talk about, obviously, in the Invisible Contract Audit, which you can find somewhere in the description, in the links above or below. It's a brilliant workbook for any woman trying to identify the invisible contracts at play in her life.